it's Alice, and today it's time to wrap up the books I read in March. I feel like this month went by really quickly and I don't quite know where the time went, but I did manage to read some books. I read 5 books, which is pretty good for me. Let's get into the reviews though. The first book that I read was Chain Gang All-Stars by Kwame, Adjei-Brenyah. And this is a dystopian novel and it's set in America. But in this America, there is this system where prisoners can become a part of this gladiator program and they can partake in these like death matches. And all of this is done in these arenas with all of these spectators, and everything is also streamed online. And if the prisoners are able to survive in this system for 3 years, they win their freedom. This was a really interesting read for me, and I have a lot of thoughts about it because it's one of those books that has so much food for thought in it, and because of that it's really good. But in other ways, like with the execution of the characters and the story, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag for me. It's a really interesting concept though, having this kind of dystopian thing in the American prison system. And it was especially interesting for me because I remember a few years ago I went down this hole of reading loads of books about the American prison system and like watching documentaries and stuff because it's so different from what it's like in Norway. And a lot of the history of it is really horrifying, but it's also interesting. And this book definitely explores some of that, and I did really like that. I really do feel like the strongest element of this book is that it makes you think, and all of the themes and the discussions. Putting a dystopian twist on something like this is a great way of highlighting issues and sort of exploring it in this way that feels really insane. But when you take a step back and you think about it, it's not as far away from reality as it should be. Like, that's what makes these books so good and so important. It is also, I will say, really brutal and really violent, which I feel like fits the story really well. Like, it's not there for a shock value or anything, it's just, it fits the world that we see in here. I do think though, and this is a thing that happens occasionally with books like these, I think this book got a little bit too caught up in the message that it's trying to give you, and because of that the story and the characters suffer a little bit. And I just think it's really like trying to tell you what it's trying to tell you, and because of that it was, I don't know, maybe it's just personal preference, but I prefer it when books like these trust the reader a little bit more. Like, the message is there and it's important and it's really interesting, but I do feel like a novel is more than just what it's trying to say. I did really like the storyline where we follow these 2 main female gladiators as they're trying to make their way through the system. I thought that was really interesting, but there is a lot of other stuff in this book as well. Like, it flits around a lot and we visit a lot of different characters, and there's something about the way that it was structured that didn't quite work for me. I do think that how the world is revealed to us in here is interesting, but I don't know, I found it really difficult to get into a good flow with this. And the only storyline that I really cared about was the 2 female gladiators, and everything else felt sort of, I wasn't really that interested in it, and it felt like it was just there to show us different parts of the world. This is a difficult one to rate though, because there are a lot of elements to it that I really like. I do think that the concept is fantastic, and just getting to see this world and this system was so interesting, and again it made me think so much. But then I feel like maybe the execution of this as an actual novel wasn't as great, and again I just prefer it when books don't necessarily like hammer in the message so incredibly hard and just trust the reader a little bit more. It is a book that you could discuss for days though. I feel like this would be a great book club book because there's so much that you can talk about in here. But yeah, it's somewhere between like a 3 and 4 star read for me, but it's one of those books that I would really recommend because I do think it's really, really interesting. It is also really brutal though, and quite violent, so just bear that in mind if you want to read it. After finishing that book though, I really needed something much, much lighter and just like pure entertainment. So I read A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking by Kingfisher. This is a fantasy novel and it follows this 14-year-old girl who is a wizard, and her magical abilities are all to do with baking and like bread. So she can make dough rise, she can make sure that like buns don't burn in the oven, she can make these little gingerbread men dance, like that's the extent of her power, and she feels like it's quite useless. But then her life is turned upside down when she finds a dead girl in the bakery one morning, and it appears like people are, not people, but someone is like hunting magical folk, and she might be next. This is my second book by this author, and it was just so much fun. Like, it was exactly what I wanted. It was cozy and magical and just super, super enjoyable. I'm finding that I'm really getting on with this author's writing. Like, there's something about it that just feels really creative to me, and I just love reading her books and seeing these magical worlds. I especially love reading about the characters, and there's always, I'm saying always, but like in the 2 books that I've read, there have been like these fun magical side characters, and I just love it so much because it just feels like so much fun. And in this one, there is a gingerbread man who's like kind of like a military man, and that's really funny. But there's also a carnivorous sourdough starter named Bob. Like, this is the level that we're at, and I just think it's so fun. This is YA, or like somewhere in between YA and middle grade, and we're following quite a young character in here, and because of that, it's a little bit of a lighter book. Like, it never gets too dark, which I really enjoyed. There are 0 romance elements in this book, which I also really liked. Like, it's just about the magic and the world and the journey that we see this main character go on. I just really, really enjoyed it. I do think it is a little bit predictable, like plot-wise. It's not the most original story, I would say. And when I was like 2/3 of the way through, I was like, I think this is where we're going. And I was right. But I still enjoyed the journey. I also think that not all of the characters are like super fully fleshed out. But I don't know, I just feel like this was a light and fun book. And when I was in it, I was just having a great time. And it was like a fun little adventure. Overall, just really entertaining, and I got a lot of chuckles out of this book, which I appreciate. And I feel like I really want to read more of this author's work. I think she has quite a lot, and I kind of just want to go get all of her books and read them, because there's something about the vibe of them that I just love. And yeah, really enjoyed this. A solid 4 out of 5 star read. Then I read this tiny little classic poetry collection. This is The Night is Darkening Around Me by Emily Brontë, and it's basically just a collection of her poems, and it includes, I think, most of her like most famous ones. This is obviously a very short little book, and I always find like poetry a little hard to review, but I'd never read any poetry by Emily Brontë. I feel like I've come across like a couple of these in my time, but I've never sat down to actually read like more than one of her poems. There's a lot I like about these poems. I like the themes of nature and death, and it feels kind of like dark and beautiful all at once. And a lot of the poems paint these really beautiful images, and it's like beautiful but also slightly depressing, which I'm into for some reason. Like with most of these kinds of collections though, there's always going to be stuff that you really like and stuff that you don't get on with as much, and I feel like this was very true for this. I would, after having read this, like to read more of her poems though, and I feel like she didn't publish that many in her lifetime, but then they found like a bunch of them after she died, I think. I just feel like I've seen collections that are much, much bigger than this, and I would maybe like to get one to like read even more. Just like it's difficult to review, it's also a difficult book to rate, because it's just sort of like a mixed collection of things I liked and didn't love as much. So it's somewhere between like 3 and 4 stars. It feels very much like rating short story collections. Like, it's always going to be, or usually it's going to be like stuff that you love and stuff that you just don't like as much. And I feel like this was very much that. So it's somewhere between like 3 and 4. Second to last, I read A Psalm for the Wilde Built by Becky. This is like a cozy fantasy or cozy science fiction novel, and it follows a tea monk who lives in a world where centuries ago robots gained consciousness and they decided to leave humanity behind, and they went to live in the wilderness, and no one has ever seen them since. This tea monk, though, ends up going on a kind of adventure, and on that adventure he runs into a robot, and the robot is basically just really curious with like how humanity is doing since they left them behind. This is a book that I've heard a lot about since I started sort of looking into the cozy fantasy genre, and I feel like I understand why everyone talks about it so much, because it was delightful. This is the kind of book that feels like a warm hug, and it's just really enjoyable and very easy to get along with. We're following this main character who's a little bit lost in life, and they decide to sort of make some changes, and on this new life path they run into this robot and they basically become friends, and it's very, like, it's lovely to see that blossom. It is a really calm book in a lot of ways, like nothing feels even remotely high stakes in this, but that doesn't mean that nothing happens in it. Like, we do go on a little bit of an adventure in here, and we see these two characters come together who have really different perspectives on things, and they've, like, their societies have been apart for so long, and it's interesting to see them come back together and all of the discussions and conversations that they have. The core of the book, I would say, is it's all about what does it mean to have a fulfilling life, and what does it mean to have purpose, and do you even need purpose to have a fulfilling life? Like, it delves into some deep topics, I guess, but it does so very gently, and it just feels very calm and relaxing, and it just feels like a pondering on life in a way. It's not quite a 5-star for me, but it's a very solid 4-star read. It was just lovely, and it is very much like the dedication says. It's for anyone who could use a break. Like, that sums this book up perfectly. Lastly, I read Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands by Heather Fawcett. This is historical fiction fantasy, and it's the sequel to Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. And this series follows a scholar studying fairy folklore and her, like, rival slash friend slash colleague. In the first book, they go to a sort of Icelandic type place where, like, the main character is making this encyclopedia of fairies, and it's basically like a research trip. And in this one, they go to the Austrian Alps in search of some stuff. I don't want to give it away, but she's making a map, and they're also looking for something. So I read the first book last year, and I just absolutely loved it. I felt like it was the perfect blend of adventure and magic, and that is something that I'm always looking for in books, and I just felt like it was perfect for me. This one gave me exactly the same feeling. Like, it sucked me right back in. I was right back with these characters, and I loved getting to go on another adventure with them. It's just really magical, and I feel like there's a great balance between characters and plot, and I just loved getting to see more of this world, or like different parts of it. I also just love following the main characters, and especially following their relationship and all of their banter and just how everything is evolving, I guess. Like, I am very invested, let me tell you. These books are also just so fun, and it's like the perfect escapism for me. They just suck me right in, and when I'm in it, I'm reminded of why I love reading so much, because I'm just having a great time. They're so fun, but they also have some substance to them. There's plot, but there's also like characters and character development, and there's magic and fun and all of the cozy vibes, and I just love it. I was also very happy to see that at the end of this book there's a little note that says, like, the main character's adventures will continue in book 3. So now I'm already impatiently waiting for the 3rd book, even though this just came out. I need the 3rd book like yesterday, but I will wait for it, and I'm sure it's gonna be great. And I just really enjoy these books. They're fun and cozy, and I just had a great time with it, and I can't wait to read more. They just feel really magical, and like it's the perfect level of magic for me. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars, and I would just like more of this, please. That was the last book though, but I'd love to know what you all have been reading lately, and also if you've read any of the books that I mentioned, what did you think? As always, thank you very much for hanging out with me today, and I will see you soon.